And welcome to another class. Glad to have you here and be part of this process as we move along here and try and somehow get the children of Israel from Egypt over into the Promised Land. Sometimes our lessons have taken a little bit far afield of that. It may look like that. But that's really kind of our goal, working our way through the Old Testament. So let's begin today, and again, just a reminder, thank you for all of you who are going to quickly punch in and just tell us where you're from. And several of you have been sharing the class on your own pages, and thank you so much. Okay, so let's take the children of Israel. They've been wandering in the Jordanian desert for a long time, and having visited that area, and it's just kind of a desolate place. And you got to think, it's got to be hard for these children of Israel to know that just over the Jordan is this land that, as we're going to talk about, the Lord has promised before they even left Egypt, that said, I'm going to take you to a land that is flowing with milk and honey. And they go, wow, that'll be good. But we're stuck, and it's just almost within shouting distance over there, and we can't quite see it. And now the moment comes when maybe we're ready to go do that. Maybe the time is now when we're going to finally go in there. So here's the promise from the Lord. I have come down to rescue Israel from the land of Egypt, and that's also a lot seen as a land of binding and contracting, okay? Land of Egypt. And bring it to a land that is goodly and spacious. You won't be confined. You won't be controlled. It's a goodly and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, we might think about that, and again, think about the Near Eastern topography. You think a land of milk and honey. Well, milk and honey might mean some things in Iowa or Kansas. In Israel, it's goat's milk, but that means that there's a lot of goats, and that means that it's a fertile place where where you can raise goats. And then honey has some discussion among scholars. There's some that are saying no, the honey is actually it's squeezing from the nectar of some of the fruits, and yet we know from the book of Ether that there were parts of that area that had the honeybee, had deseret, and regardless, you're going to get a rich, spacious place with lots of sweetness and everything. So that sounds really good. And so they're going to spend all their time in the desert, hoping, looking forward to, anticipating this time when they're going to finally get to see a land filled with milk and honey. So what happens when they finally get there? Well, interestingly enough, after 40 years, they're directed to not just bring the whole gang in there. We don't know how many hundreds of thousands there were. But at the same time, so we're going to send spies. And they take spies from every tribe. And they're going to kind of quietly sneak in and check out what's going on. Where are the people? And they actually end up traveling. These spies will travel all over both Judea and up into Galilee, all the way out to the coast that is now Tel Aviv and Haifa, because they're really intent on, let's see exactly, because we're going to bring all these people in, and they've been given this land, but who lives there, and who still lives there, and what do they look like? And so these spies are going to go in there, and they're going to kind of check all this out. Well, as we know, the spies come back, and here's going to be their report. And they're going to tell the people, we came to the land to which thou sentest. It does flow with milk and honey. It's a pretty rich place, especially if you get in the upper Galilee. I can't even tell you how sweet the fruit is in the upper Galilee. It is amazing. And this is its fruit. They brought with them, they had a pole on which, and then they hung a large cluster of grapes from it and said, this is from this land flowing with milk and honey. I think it's called Ascaloth, the Valley of Ascaloth, and here's this cluster of grapes. Okay, so that's the good news. Here's the bad news. The people who dwell there are very strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. So yeah, on one side this land is there, but it's occupied. There are people there, and the people who dwell there are very strong, and the cities are fortified. Okay, now, so they've got kind of a public disaster, public relations disaster going on here. Everybody's going to gather around to hear the report of the spies, and you can see like Moses and Joshua and Caleb that are kind of waiting. Yes, tell these people and everything, and then to their horror, they're hearing something that would be like having your kids get up in sacrament meeting. They start telling family secrets, and you'd be like, "No, don't do that." Well, this is kind of that way. You know, these spies are saying, "Yes, it's a land of milk and honey. Yes, here's the grapes. And by the way, oh my gosh, you should see these guys in the fortified cities." Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up and occupy it, for we are able to overcome it." Dang it, we can do this. This is possible. Okay? Now, Caleb's trying to give them a pep talk in the middle of all of this. Okay? But these guys won't shut up. Then the people who'd gone up with him said, "No, we're not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. They are really big people." Now, you have to go back and picture last time we were talking about the Lord saying, "Who are you going to choose?" And this is, "I am the God who defeated the Egyptians and the Red Sea and the plagues," and you know, and these guys are just looking at it on the surface and going, "Nope, they're stronger than we are." So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of this land that they had spied out, saying, and listen to this, "The land through which we have gone to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants." Now, in a sense, we might think about it's a goodly land, but because it's a goodly land, they attack one another. So this is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw are of great height. There was a tradition of giants in the land that goes all the way back to Noah. And they said the people there are of great height. And so they're bigger, they're stronger. And there we saw the size of them. And then they're going to say, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers. We were just really small compared to these big guys. And so we seemed to them. They could see us and see we're small, they're big. There's no way that we're going to be able to get to and enjoy and conquer these people to be able to secure what God has given to us, this land of milk and honey. So here's the dilemma. And I, as we're going to talk today, I think that's a dilemma that we have in a lot of our lives that we struggle with. In that we have been given promises, but it just seems to us that those promises are not doable. Can't be done. We have been called to serve in a calling, and maybe the bishop or stake president says, "You can do this, it's doable," and you're thinking, "I'm like a grasshopper. There's no way I can do this. I'm not capable of doing this." So here's some of the questions that I would have of that. And as you're listening to this, I want you to kind of ask yourself a question. When you picture your promised land, the things that the Lord has promised you, first of all, what do you picture? If you could have your promised land, your land of flowing with milk and honey, are you thinking of a particular home? Are you thinking of a particular thing with your kids? Are you thinking about where you're living? Are you thinking about that skinnier. We had a wonderful man today talk about in a talk, talked about the fact that as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And I came up to him afterward and I said, you know what, I think of ice cream and I already get fatter just in looking. So we picture these things, right? We imagine. Think about what you picture as your land flowing with milk and honey. Now, so not only is it what you picture and what you're expecting, but now take it one step farther. What does it feel to you has been promised from the Lord, from a lot of different places? What does it feel like that you have been promised? And think about those things that maybe have been promised but haven't yet occurred. Then what stands between, what challenges, what large people, what fortified cities stand between me and what I'm picturing and the promised land that I want, but yet I've been promised that I'm going to get that. Okay? So, in a sense, I want to set this up a little bit with this. Well, one of the things that I get when I'm working particularly with couples where one of the spouses has done something that breached trust. And I'm always pretty quick to say, when somebody says, she hurt me, and say, how do I end up trusting her again? He did this. How do I trust him? And I'm always pretty fast to say, well, there's a formula that you have to keep in mind. And that's that trust equals time plus consistency. Part of it just takes time to rebuild trust. But part of it is consistency. Now, that's a problem. Because let's say that somebody struggles, for instance, with pornography, and a spouse is saying, I need time plus consistency to trust you. And I'm trying to say to them, this is an addiction and there is going to be relapses. And oftentimes, like the wife will say, no, I need him to commit to never do it again. I need time plus consistency. And I'm trying to say that consistency is going to mean that we get longer and longer periods of time without a relapse. And they say, no, that's not acceptable. There needs to be never a relapse ever again. And that's just not the case with addictiveness. But part of that time plus consistency is then having to add one more element to it. And that is, now we have to add the element of learning how an addiction works, learning how a particular spouse is going to rebuild their life, how I begin to trust even though they're not perfect, even though they're going to have some things that still impinge on my trust, and what points of a breaking of a trust are just a bridge too far, and at that point I just need to walk away. Well, that's hard. That's hard to be able to then begin to rebuild that sense of trust, that sense of promise that we thought we had that somehow gets lost. Well, hold on to that idea for just a second, that idea of rebuilding trust. Because now, when we're going to talk about the importance of learning to have faith in God, faith in a divine being that we haven't seen requires certain things. And one of those things is going to be that in order to fully develop faith in not just like a spouse, but also, or an institution, but also to develop God. To fully develop faith requires that we have to develop certain things. Let me give you 3 of them. We have to, if it's going to be in God, in order to develop faith, we have to have a belief in God who does make promises to us. He's going to require some things from us, but we have a God that has made promises about our future. that we can't yet see. Promises about a promised land. Promises about a celestial kingdom that is flowing with milk and honey. Promises about what will happen in our lives. The promise is that the joy that we will experience. God has made a number of promises to us, and that we're having to have faith in. Now, in order to do that, we also have to have a belief in a God who we believe is capable of keeping those promises. Think about if somebody is just making promise after promise after promise to you, and you're just saying, there's no way that they can do that. They're not capable of doing that. And we're saying you have to have a belief in a God, in a Father in heaven, a Mother in heaven. We have to have a belief in God that they are capable of delivering on the promises. Now, how do we know that? Well, it's not just to believe in their omnipotence and their power, but in order to help us learn how to trust, and in order for us to learn how to rely on those promises, we have an added knowledge. And that's that added knowledge of a God who has demonstrated throughout history that He does keep His promises. I believe that one of the very, very purposes of Scripture is not just to inspire us, but it's also to prove to us that God makes promises and that God keeps promises, and that prophets and other people have testified He said He would do it, and He did it. This is a God we can trust. Think about the very title page of the Book of Mormon. You think about, why was the Book of Mormon written? Where the title page of the Book of Mormon, it's going to say that it's written to the Lamanites. So why? So that they may know the promises that were made to their fathers. And because of the promises that they saw fulfilled in this record of the Book of Mormon, I can now trust that He made promises to our fathers about what this will mean for us, and that God intends to keep those promises. And I have a record of it in the Book of Mormon that says how this works. Okay? So that's part of what we're trying to do, that our knowledge and understanding of God and His patterns as we're digging through the Scriptures is searching through and finding this deity that makes promises, has the ability to make promises, and keeps promises, so that we can trust and change our lives and turn our will over to this great being who will keep the promise of all of that. Now, this is where this gets more challenged about how that process actually works. One of the quotes that floats around in our culture, and I've heard it quoted by a number of people in certain places, is this one: that obedience is the first law of heaven. Obedience is the first law of heaven. First comes obedience, then everything else. Though it is interesting that the whole plan of salvation started with disobedience in the Garden of Eden. But obedience is the first law of heaven. Unfortunately, this has an effect on us. And it has an effect, I think, because it bumps up against some of the Protestant leanings that we have that affect us. So now we go into the Scriptures, and what is it that backs up this idea of is straight out obedience before we're going to see any promises whatsoever? That's where we're going. So here's two Scriptures that heavily influence what we think about this idea of obedience and blessings and promises. Okay, here's the first one. You're going to know both of these. That first comes out of section 82, the Doctrine and Covenants. I, the Lord, am bound when you do what I say. But when you do not what I say, ye have no promise. So promises in this case are tied to doing what He says, And when we do that, this would suggest that we bind somehow the Lord, that he doesn't have a choice in it. So that's section 82. Then we have another one, section 130, that sometimes also gets thrown into this mix. And it states this: there is a law, irrevocably decreed in heaven before the foundations of this world, upon which all blessings are predicated. And when we obtain, listen closely, when we obtain any blessing from God, it is by obedience to that law upon which it is predicated. Okay? So again, you can see where we swim in this area of obedience being the first law of heaven, especially in the way that we look at these scriptures. So what's wrong with that? Well, that affects very much what promises we're looking for and how we think we can get them. Okay? So here's what happens. When we strictly make it about obedience and all the things that we have to do, strict obedience, if we're not careful, we have the effect of turning the whole plan of salvation kind of into a vending machine. And that vending machine has a lot of goodies that are in here that we would really like. And you think, well, how do I get that? Well, based on what we've just heard, what we're going to do in order to get the goodies, we have to pay out obedience. So you want the goodies, you're going to pay in a certain amount, kind of check and see what the level of obedience is required for this. If I'm just wanting kind of a celestial candy bar, then I just only have to pay out just a little bit of obedience to get a celestial candy bar. But if I want the celestial bag of chips, well, the cost is much higher, requires much more obedience. So I've got to decide how much of the snacks I want before I can supply how much obedience I need to pour in there. And as I do that, then I'm going to pay in obedience, and out comes the blessings, and there I go. Well, that sounds well and good, and we like the sound of that, except there's a major problem, as any of us know. What happens if we go to the heavenly vending machine, we pour in our obedience, and we don't get anything out? Somehow our change must have gotten caught up in there, or it's not working well, or I thought the price was this and I paid the price and I'm not getting it. We want that one-to-one connection between my obedience should kick out of that vending machine a certain amount of blessings. God is bound, is he not? This has to work. And so this leaves us hanging with questions when that doesn't work. And some of these this is just a sampling, and we all know these. We all struggle with this. What do we say to a single woman who looks at her patriarchal blessing and talks about family and marriage and all these blessings, and she's maybe getting older and she looks at it and says, none of this has happened. I was promised things and it didn't happen. And then we start making jokes about, well, turns out my spouse was, killed in the war or something. Or the other possibility is simply, maybe I just haven't poured in enough obedience to be able to get the blessing that I'm looking for. Now, how about this one? We pour into that vending machine the word of wisdom, living it. Man, I'm living it perfectly. But I'm supposed to have the blessings of health in the navel, marrow in the bones, and we keep having serious illnesses. We may even get almost fatal illnesses, and yet we kept the word of wisdom, and we're not necessarily getting the payout out of the machine. How about this one? We were promised that if the family that prays together stays together. So what do? We prayed together as a family. We did family home evening. We're doing come follow me and everything. And our kids rebel anyway. We made covenants. We did it. We got up. We didn't want to get up at 6 a.m. to read scriptures, but we did it anyway, and our kids rebelled anyway. And so, again, is there something faulty in the vending machine that's not working? We're going to start wanting to rattle it a little bit, or rattle heaven and just say, hey, wait a minute, I paid my dues. I'm not getting the blessings, because it's about obedience, right? We pay tithing. I paid in the tithing. And we can never get ahead. In fact, my husband lost his job, or, that we're supposed to be watched over and taken care of. We just didn't know watched over and taken care of was going to mean that the bishop was paying our bills. And yet the obedience isn't kicking out the stuff on the other end. So let me go back and challenge a little bit, maybe add a little bit more perspective on those two scriptures we just quoted. Section 82. I, the Lord, am bound when you do what I say. But when you do not do what I say, you have no promise. We need to read that scripture in context, because what comes next after that is the Lord is saying, wherefore verily I say unto you that it's expedient for my servants to be bound. Oh, they're going to be bound too. Oh, what? Bound by what? By a bond. To be bound together by a bond and covenant that cannot be broken by transgression, except judgment comes immediately. Okay? Well, the judgment and the transgression is not the brotherly binding to one another, covenant with one another, to serve one another and to love one another. We look at the school of the prophets and things that Prophet Joseph Smith was trying to get across to people, that this binding, that the Lord being bound, He's bound to us not like He has to kick out blessings, though He very much wants to, but I am bound to you with a binding and a bond of charity and love and connection. And you and I will work together to do great things. That's the binding. The binding is not wrapping God up in a way that He has no choice and He has to pay things out. Okay? Let's look at the second one. That was, there's a law irrevocably decreed in heaven. Now, you have to stop on this and read it carefully, because sometimes we blow right through this and we just say, this seems to say there's a one-to-one connection. The law of tithing has this law, the law of health has this law, the law of families has this law, and everything. We want to make it a one-to-one. We love equations in the church so that we can just plug in our obedience into the vending machine and get the blessing. Okay? It's not what this says. There is a law irrevocably decreed in heaven before the foundation of this world, upon which all blessings are predicated. So let me take out what's in the commas. There is a law upon which all blessings are predicated. Now can you hear it? And when we retain any blessings, it's by obedience to that law that was instituted before the foundations of the world. Okay? What is that law on which all the prophets hang? All the blessings hang. Well, we should know this one, right? Matthew 27. The Lord Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And then he'll quote the prophet Hillel, and he's going to say, on this love of God, this love of neighbor, hangs all the prophets. That's the law. That what we are, our blessings are predicated on our ability to love God in such a way so that He is able to change us and evolve us into the people that He has in mind for us. It's not, and because of that, will we obey? Yes. Will we keep the commandments? Yes. Will we receive the saving ordinances of the gospel? Yes. But it'll come from such a place of love and devotion as opposed to a duty. And then we're allowing God to bless us with promises beyond anything that we would imagine. Because unfortunately, when we're playing back with that vending machine, we're going to have a very limited sense. I'm pouring in my blessings, and I have expectations of what promises that's going to turn out. Okay? So what is it that he's promising? Well, I'm recording this on a Sunday. We went to church today, and I heard again the promises made in the sacrament, and where we have the Lord's great promise to us that as we go and we partake of the sacrament and we witness unto Him that we're willing to do all that He's asked us to do to the best of our ability, and then we're going to relapse and we're going to need help again. What's His great promise in the sacrament? That we will always have His Spirit to be with us. If we have His Spirit, we know we're being filled by that Spirit of promise that is going to guide and direct us in all that we do. Now, two last things that I think we need to keep in mind with promises. First is Paul in speaking to the Hebrews. And here is a Jewish prophet speaking to the Jews that are struggling with their idea of what Abraham promised to them, and yet they're seeing the Gentiles also getting those blessings. And he's going to say to them, we desire, those and the brethren working with you, we desire each of you to demonstrate the same eagerness for the fulfillment of hope until the end, so that you will not become sluggish. But then listen how he puts this. I don't want you to be sluggish, but imitators of those who inherit the promises. And those could be Roman, those could be Greek, those could be Hebrew. The inheritors of the promise through faith and patience. For those children of Israel looking at their land flowing with milk and honey, they were going to have patience in terms of how the Lord would help them deal with the giants in the land and the fortified cities. We have this hope, Paul says to them, as fixed and sure anchor in a storm. For the soul that reaches inside the veil where Jesus, our forerunner, entered for us. We have our mediator on the other side. But it requires faith and patience for us to inherit the promises that were given to us. Okay, so here's the challenge. We have this learning gap about how we obtain promises from the Lord. And if we set aside that it's just completely about promises or about obedience, it's going to get in our way. So here's my question. Is there a difference? Think about it for a second. Is there a difference between the promise we have received, promises you've received, and the manner in which God intends to fulfill those promises? Is there a difference between what He intends and what you're expecting? How large is our understanding gap between what God says He will do and how or what we expect, how He will go about doing it? Because sometimes when our expectations are such that we expect God will do it one way, we're going to miss how He intends to do it, which is always better and cooler than what we had in mind. That's the challenge. And it's the challenge I'm going to leave with you today, is that I believe that one of the things that happens, especially if we can get outside of the idea of my obedience has to immediately kick loose the blessings. If we begin to say, I'm going to trust in the Lord that fulfills His promises, I don't know how He's going to do it. Because for the children of Israel, they did inherit the land. They did handle the city of Jericho. They did end up dealing with the Canaanites and the Amorites and all those guys. And the Lord had a way that He would do that. But it was different when the people were believing it's just going to be our obedience, our stuff, our ability is going to kick loose these promises. And he's going to say, no, I just want you to follow me. Love me. Love your neighbor. And let me do my thing. Let me fight your battles. He's going to say over and over and over to Israel through their entire history, quit trying to fight your battles. Let me fight your battles. I'll show you how to do it. It could just be David with a stone and Goliath. Let me fight your battles, and I will fulfill my promises. I bear you my testimony, brothers and sisters, that we do have to overcome through our faith and education and learning and testimony to overcome our learning gap and let God do His thing, His way, not our way. And watch what great promises end up happening in spite of ourselves. I bear you my testimony that it's true, and I leave that with you in Jesus' name. Amen.